Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. I bow at the lotus feet of my Guru Paramhansa Yogananda. I bow to his great lineage of teachers, Mahavatar Babaji, Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Shri Yukteswar Giri, and I bow to my divine friend and guide, Swami Kriyananda. Namaste, friends. Welcome to the 7th episode of this series on the Mahabharata. I have to say, I've been having a lot of fun and intensely enjoying this process of sharing the story with all of you and sharing the teachings of my Guru Paramhansa Yogananda. And I really hope you have all been enjoying this journey as well with me. So, in the last episode, we saw the birth of the Pandava brothers. We started the story off with Shantanu, and I want to briefly revisit the important symbolism that we talked about in the last couple of episodes. So, Dhritarashtra, the grandson of Shantanu, represents the blind mind, and he marries Gandhari, who represents the power of desires, and to them are born the 100 Kaurava brothers. The Kaurava brothers represent the lower part of our own nature, all those tendencies and attributes within our own selves that keep us bound to delusion, that keep us bound to our own ego. That's what the Kaurava brothers represent. And the eldest of them is Duryodhana, who represents all our material desires. And on the other side, Pandu represents pure intelligence or the intellect, and his wife Kunti is a symbol for renunciation. And to them are born the 5 Pandava brothers, who are in a way symbols for the upward pointed energies inside our own spine. Now, in a sense, the Pandava brothers are born to Kunti, Madri, and Pandu. However, they are also of divine origin because they are actually fathered by gods who are invited by a boon that Kunti earlier had. What the story is trying to tell us here is that these 5 chakras, the upward pointed energy present in our own spine, these 5 elements that present the pathway to our own liberation, they are not man made, they are not self created. These are divine seeds that have been given to us that reside within ourselves in order to show us the way or the path to free ourselves from all the sufferings and the delusions that we face in this world. So the 5 Pandava brothers are symbols for that 5 elements. They represent the 5 lower chakras. Yudhishthira represents the throat chakra, the upward pointed energy there. Which is a symbol for calmness and wisdom and righteousness, and Bhima represents the strength of the heart, and Arjuna represents the willpower and the focus that comes from the navel chakra. Nakula represents the creativity and the fluidity that comes from the sacral center, and Sahadeva represents the steadfastness and loyalty that is present in the lowest chakra, which is the coccyx center. So these 5 brothers are the 5 Pandavas who are going to finally battle all the Kaurava brothers in the battle of Kurukshetra and win the battle. So that's where we left the story. Since Pandu died after the birth of the Pandavas because of a curse he earlier had, Kunti returns to the palace of Hastinapura with her 5 sons. And so the Kaurava and the Pandava brothers are growing up together in the palace of Hastinapura. Now, in this episode, I would like to talk about a couple of important characters. I will see how much I can get through in one episode. The first of those characters is Drona or Dronacharya. Now, the Pandava and the Kaurava brothers have moved back to the palace of Hastinapura, and Bhishma, who's like their grandfather, or rather great-grandfather, grandfather, is very attached to them. Bhishma represents that ego awareness, ego consciousness, which identifies with the body, and all these children are born out of his own lineage. So he's very attached to them, and he's fond of all the Pandava and the Kaurava brothers. And he wants to find an able teacher who can train all these brothers in the arts of warfare and archery so that they can become good princes and good kings of the land. And the teacher that he finds is Drona or Dronacharya. Now, Drona has an interesting past, and that brings us to the second character that I want to talk about, which is Drupada, who is the king of this kingdom called Panchala. Drona is born in a Brahmin family. He's born to the sage Bharadwaja. And when he's very young, he is living with his father in his ashram or hermitage. And the king of Panchala sends his son Drupada to be trained under the sage Bharadwaja. So Drupada is also residing at the hermitage of sage Bharadwaja and training under him in all the arts and archery and warfare to become an able king of the kingdom of Panchala. So as they're residing in that same hermitage, Drupada and Drona become very, very close friends. They do everything together and they develop a lot of fondness for each other as they grow up through the years of childhood. And in those days, Drupada makes a promise to Drona. He says, when I become the king of this land, when I become the king of Panchala after my father's time, I will have all the wealth in the land and I will give you half of the kingdom just to honor our friendship, this friendship that we are sharing, growing up in the same hermitage under the tutelage of sage Bharadwaja. So that's the promise that Drupada makes. So later on, as one would expect, the king of Panchala passes on the throne to Drupada and he becomes the king ruling all of the land. And at this point, Drona is married and he has a son of his own, and he doesn't have a lot of wealth. He is living in poverty. So he goes to the court of Drupada and not exactly asking for half the kingdom, but in a way asking him to honor his promise and to take care of Drona because now he's in dire need of resources to fend for his family. So when he approaches Drupada with that intention, Drupada immediately sees why he is here and does not honor or respect the promise he had earlier made as a small boy. He scorns Drona, he ridicules him in the court, in front of everybody, and says, how could you imagine that a promise that I made as a small boy would be something that you think I would hold on to when I become the king? That was just something that I said in a casual way. That's not something I meant. And this kingdom is all mine. There's no reason, I don't have any obligation to give anything to you. He was defending his own kingdom, and Drona is extremely hurt by these words of Drupada, but he cannot do anything. After all, Drupada is the king, and Drona is merely a poor Brahmin trying to find a living for himself. So he leaves the court. However, he harbors that deep feeling of vengeance in his heart as he walks out. He wants to take revenge. He wants to get back at Drupada for how he was ridiculed in front of everybody else. Now, the story makes a lot more sense when we understand what Drupada and Drona represent as symbols. Drona, as we will see, he's going to become the teacher of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And he represents samskara, or the power of habit patterns that we create ourselves. And so all the positive and the negative virtues, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, have to be trained through the power of these habit patterns. That's why he is the teacher that trains both sides that are going to fight the war. And Drupada represents extreme dispassion. He represents that part of us that shuns the world. In the West, the English word dispassion can sometimes seem to have a negative connotation in the sense of being indifferent or something like that. As Yogananda explained it, it's an extremely positive quality. What that quality of dispassion represents is that intense yearning for God. It's that yearning of the soul and the shunning of all worldly enjoyment or sensory pleasures. Without dispassion, we can never turn our back to all those things of the world that are constantly drawing us through our senses. So in that sense, dispassion is an extremely virtuous quality, and that's what Drupada stands for. But that dispassion also shuns habit. Because habit, the very foundation of these habit patterns that Drona represents, is a sense of familiarity and the comfort that comes out of that sense of familiarity, which is a groove that we find ourselves in. And Drupada shuns that exact comfort that Drona represents, because he represents that act of turning the back from all those things that provide that kind of comfort or enjoyment or pleasure. So he represents an intense part of our own positive nature, and that's why we find this unique equation between Drupada and Drona, which is going to play out even more as the story progresses. But now coming back to the story, so Drona is harboring this feeling of vengeance in his heart to get back at Drupada, and Bhishma approaches him at this point. Bhishma knows that Drona has great skills and talent because he trained under his father, who was a great sage Bharadwaja, and he knows that he can be a great teacher for the Pandava and the Kaurava brothers. So Drona accepts the offer, and all the brothers start learning under Drona. And he trains them all kinds of warfare, archery, and all the essential learnings that are required for somebody to rule the country. And so he becomes a glorious teacher who makes warriors out of these young children, the Pandava and the Kaurava brothers. Now, although the Pandava and the Kaurava brothers grow up together under the tutelage of Drona, they don't always get along all that well. And one of the main reasons for that is their maternal uncle Shakuni, the Kaurava's maternal uncle. As we already know, the Kauravas and Pandavas represent opposing poles of our own consciousness, so it is not surprising that they cannot coexist. But also Shakuni, who is a symbol for attachment, plays a very vital role in polarizing the Kaurava brothers against the Pandavas, because he's counseling all those negative parts inside our own selves and telling the Kaurava brothers that the Pandavas are their enemies and they're here to take away what rightfully belongs to them. So Duryodhana and all his brothers turn against the Pandavas even when they're young children. And there are a lot of stories told about how they fight with each other as pranks and how they try to attack Bhima and things like that. I'm going to skip all of that in interest of time. The one other important thing that I would mention is the relationship between Arjuna and Drona. Now, Drona is equally the teacher of all the Pandava and the Kaurava brothers. But as we know, like any teacher always has his or her favorites, Drona also has his. And his favorite is his student Arjuna. Arjuna is not only exceptionally talented and is a warrior like no one else has seen before, he also has great willpower and great ability to focus. And Drona is very impressed by all these exceptional talents that Arjuna carries. In fact, he takes it upon himself as an objective in his life to make Arjuna the greatest warrior of all times, that nobody in all the worlds can ever fight Arjuna or win against him. It only makes sense because what Arjuna represents is that power of the third chakra in the positive way. He represents that act of self-control, of willpower, of focus to be able to draw our energy in and lift it upwards. And the true purpose of habit and the true purpose of that kind of discipline that comes through repeating a habit is to be able to train and be able to focus in that way. So it only makes sense that Drona is very attached to Arjuna because it is Drona's life purpose to train Arjuna and make him a great warrior. So they share this very sweet relationship, although they're going to stand against each other during the battle of Kurukshetra. But it is that connection that they share, which we will see will play out in the story even more. Now, when all the brothers become young warriors, Drona finds a great opportunity to ask something of them that they cannot refuse. It is tradition that the guru can ask a guru dakshina of his students once they complete their training. What it means is a fee or a payment in exchange for all that they have gained from him. And it may not be wealth or kind, it could be anything that the guru wants his students to do, and they have to do that for him because he has given a great deal to them. So as a fee for all the training that he has given to the Pandava and Kaurava brothers, Drona asks them to fight a battle against Drupada, to wage a war against the kingdom of Panchala and win the kingdom from Drupada so that he can be humiliated in the battlefield, all for the sake of the revenge. As we already saw, he was ridiculed by Drupada. So the Kaurava brothers first approach the battlefield. They take all the armies of Hastinapura and they wage a war against Drupada. Now, Drupada is not any ordinary warrior either. He trained under the same guru as Drona and he has an army behind him as well. So he is able to easily fight the Kaurava brothers and defeat them in battle. So they come back unable to pay Drona what he had asked of them. Drona then approaches the Pandava brothers to do the same thing. And under the leadership of Arjuna, they now go to war against the king Drupada. Now, Drupada is extremely shocked at the power and the strength that the Pandava brothers bring to this battle, and he's not able to fight them as easily as he did the Kaurava brothers. And not only that, he is extremely impressed by this Prince Arjuna. What a great warrior that he's facing in the battlefield. And as much as he is himself being defeated, he cannot fail to be impressed by the power of this young warrior that he's seeing, like no other he has seen before. So he does lose the battle, and the Pandava brothers bring to Drona, in return for all the training they have received from him, the crown of the kingdom of Panchala and Drupada's defeat. Now, Drona at this point really wants to humiliate Drupada. He wants to play the higher man, and instead of taking the entire kingdom away from him, he says, I'm not going to do to you what you did to me. I'm going to only keep half of this kingdom and return the half back to you so that you can go back and rule. But you will always remember this humiliation and defeat that you faced through my disciples, and all that is because of how you ridiculed me in the court. So that's what he does to Drupada. As we all know, the story does not end there. The tit for tat between Drona and Drupada keeps going on till the end of the war, until both of them eventually die. But again, this is one of those turning points in that. Now Drona gets the upper hand because he has trained all these spiritual virtues. Drona, who represents that power of habit patterns, he has trained all the Pandava and the Kaurava brothers, and through that training, he has used those spiritual virtues to defeat that extreme dispassion of turning away from the world. Because the Pandava brothers, they represent nascent spiritual virtues at this point. In a way, they haven't gone through a few other phases that they're about to go on after this point in the story. So at this point, they're still attached to habit. They still need that discipline. They still need that groundedness, and they have to shun that dispassion that is fighting against it. So they defeat Drupada and they please Drona. Now Drupada does something else after this point. In order to get back at Drona, he feels he needs offsprings that can actually take on this challenge. So he does an intense fire sacrifice called the Putra Kameshti Yajna. He takes upon himself a lot of austerities and does this great ritualistic fire sacrifice to get offsprings that might help him win against Drona and to get back at him again. The story keeps going on, like I said. And there are two offsprings that he gets through this fire ceremony. The two are Draupadi and Drishtadyumna. And we will briefly see what these two represent because they are very important characters in the story. You could ask anybody anywhere who knows the story of the Mahabharata, and without skipping a breath, they would say the heroine of the story is Draupadi. Because she, as soon as she comes into the picture, starts defining the story in a way like no other character. Because what she represents is the Kundalini energy. We don't have a lot of time to discuss the entire philosophy and the metaphysics of what Kundalini represents, but I'll briefly talk about it in this episode. And we'll also talk more because we'll be seeing Draupadi a lot more from this point on. What Kundalini is that spinal energy that is coiled under the coccyx center in our own spine. It is almost an infinite source of energy. Kundalini is that divine seed that resides within all of us. However, when we are in delusion, when all our senses are pointed outwards, this energy is coiled up, keeping us bound to that delusion. It is like that boat anchor which resides beneath the coccyx center in our own spine, and it keeps us bound to that ocean of suffering and the ocean of delusion. Now, any spiritual practice that leads us to liberation has to release that energy, has to release that anchor so that it can flow within our own spine and can transmute or transcend all those lower natures that are keeping us bound to our own ego and that sense of separateness. And that's exactly what Draupadi represents. She is that Kundalini energy that is awakened through intense dispassion. Without Drupada, who represents that kind of shunning of sensory pleasure, Kundalini cannot be awakened because Kundalini is coiled and dormant as long as we are involved in the sensory world and in the material pleasures of this world. However, through his austerities, Drupada awakens that Kundalini energy. And that is that same energy that flows through the 5 chakras, or rather the 7 chakras in our subtle spine, and releases all that is holding us back. So as soon as Kundalini is awakened, her only objective is to be able to liberate us, is to be able to open all these chakras and flow freely in the astral spine, because that's really where she belongs. And she belongs at this point of Sahasrara, or the thousand petal lotus, which is her true seat, because she's the queen. She represents that divine goddess, that universal cosmic energy that is flowing through all of us. But it is that infinite potential is not always accessible to us when we are still living in this world of delusion. So Draupadi, the birth of Draupadi is the awakening of Kundalini. And that happens through the intense austerity of Drupada and his great fire sacrifice. The other offspring that comes out of the fire sacrifice is Drishtadyumna. He represents what Yogananda called the clear light of intuition. Because again, when our senses are pointed outwards and we are completely engaged in life as is, on this plane, we lack that clear center of soul knowing, of that intuition that comes only by that act of austerity, of that dispassion, and of being able to pull back the energy into our own spine. So as a result, as a fruit of that austerity that Drupada performs, the other offspring that is born is that clear light of intuition. Because when you have that kind of a sense of true soul knowing, then you have true knowledge to be able to overcome delusion. As we will see, he is a great warrior who is going to play an important part in the role of in the battle of Mahabharata. So in the next episode, we will see more of what happens after this, and how the Pandava and the Kaurava brothers are still going to sort it out in the palace of Hastinapura. But until then, God bless you all.